So let me introduce our two guests. Tim, over here, Tim Soutphommasane is a political philosopher, commentator and currently postdoctoral research fellow in the Institute for Democracy and Human Rights at the University of Sydney. Tim writes a regular column in The Age, if you're an Age reader. He used to write a regular column in The Australian. Before that, he's a member of the National Australia Day Council and the Australian Multicultural Council. And Tim put everyone else who writes to shame last year by publishing two weighty books in 1 year. The Virtuous Citizen, which is a philosophical book about citizenship, and then the book we're discussing today, Don't Go Back to Where You Came From, which is really a treatise in defence of multiculturalism, or in praise of multiculturalism, perhaps. He's published other books as well, including Reclaiming Patriotism a few years ago. And Tim has also worked in politics on the private staff of Bob Carr when he was Premier of New South Wales. Tim is of Chinese and Lao extraction and a first-generation Australian. He was raised in the southwestern suburbs of Sydney, and he completed his PhD and his Masters of Philosophy at Oxford University. So, welcome, Tim. Pat Grant is a renowned Melbourne cartoonist. His work has appeared in many magazines, including Meanjin, Going Down Swinging, The Lifted Brow, Art Link, and Australia's Surfing Life and Tracks surf magazines. I'm told, though, that all his best stuff comes out in his zine, his personally self-published zine called Lumpen. And we're talking today about his graphic novel Blue, which was published in response to, let's say, as a kind of response to, let's say, the Cronulla riots. So, interesting couple of... my own background, by the way, I'm Peter Mayers. For a long time I was a broadcaster with Radio National. I'm now the Cities Fellow at the Grattan Institute in Melbourne, a research institute. But I think I'm here today more because I have an interest in issues of immigration. I wrote a book a long time ago now about asylum seekers and refugees, and I've followed on an interest in other aspects of migration. So I'm also a first-generation Australian. No one ever says that in my introductions. My parents were migrants from Britain. Pat, what about you? What generation are you?
I think I'm about sixth now, but yeah, it goes way back to, I think there's a convict that started it all, convict squatter.
And there's also, Tim very kindly on his website tells people how to pronounce his surname, Soutphommasane. People get my surname wrong as well. In the program, I'm Peter Hares. And I didn't know how to say Pat's name because I grew up in Adelaide, so I wanted to say Pat Grant, but I think it should be Pat Grant because he comes from New South Wales. Right? So this book is called Immigrant. This session is called Immigrant Nation. I think it could equally be called Beaches, Barrels and Boats, or something like that. Barrels referring, of course, in this instance to waves, because Pat's novel is also a surf comic, his novel. And I want to start, both books deal in very different ways with issues of negotiating difference, of managing diversity and change, and questions of identity. And they both have to do with beaches. As we can see, Blue, as I said, is a surf novel, and we can see from Tim's book that it has on its front cover a picture of someone on a beach. And beaches are places of encounter in Australia. They represent for us in our minds, perhaps if not in legal reality, the edge of our territory, the place where encounters have taken place throughout our colonial history, and of course where boats tend to wash up or land or arrive. So we were going to begin though with a particular beach at a particular time, and that is Cronulla Beach, December 2005, known now as the day of the Cronulla riots. And Pat, you were there.
Yeah, I was there.
What were you doing there?
So I'd been in Wollongong on that weekend for a zine fair. It was a sort of a punk DIY event, and I was making dinky little self-published comic books at the time, and I went down to Wollongong to see if I could shift some units. And on the way home, I was on the way home in the car with some friends, and we wanted to go for a swim, and we went to the beach. The most convenient beach was Cronulla, and it just happened that we'd sort of missed the lead up in the mainstream media, and we just sort of arrived on the beach and sort of bore witness to the build-up to the sort of violent stuff that happened on that day.
You've actually done another comic about that, which is called Waiting for Something to Happen. But just describe that atmosphere for us on that day.
My experience was very, very different to the sort of the experience you might have had from watching the news that night. It was very sort of ordinary. It felt like a creepy Australia day. I was there, like I said, before things got really violent, but it felt like everyone in Cronulla had come out to celebrate Australianness in a fairly sort of innocuous way. And then slowly it started to, I think at the point where we realised that almost everyone was really, really drunk, we decided that it was probably going to get ugly. and that's when we left. So, and in the 2 hours that passed in getting home and unpacking, we sort of turned on the TV and then we saw the Cronulla riot that everyone in Australia sort of knows. But I should actually say that event was really a huge part of my part of the inspiration for this book. But there was also something that happened a week before when I was in Mexico that had a huge impact. I was at a beach called Puerto Escondido, which is a sort of famous sort of surf location, and I caught a wave and I got dropped in by this enormous Mexican local surfer, and I kind of I sort of, you know, in surfer talk, dropped in is just like the guy took my wave. It's sort of a lack of courtesy.
Cut in on
you. He cut me off. And I sort of I yelled at him because it's not on to do that really, and he sort of turned around. We were sort of both surfing alongside each other, and he turned around and he sort of put his board on the rail and turned really sharply and sort of rammed me, and the tip of his surfboard, you know, hit me right in the bum hole.
Ouch.
And so I got up and we had this kind of strange confrontation, and I was the other there, you know. I was the sort of, you know, interloper from afar, and I kind of yelled at this guy, and he just said, "You come here, you respect the locals." And those two events, which happened almost a week apart, really kind of like resonate. There's some sort of resonance between them. Oh, excuse me, and that's what sort of got me going in this weird investigation into nationalism, localism, the beach, and what it is to be Australian.
And we'll talk a bit more about what Blue's actually about in a while, because it's not about Cronulla as such. It's as you said, a response to Cronulla. But Tim, let's stick with Cronulla for the moment, because for many people, people read Cronulla in December 2005 in different ways. For some people, it is a sign of multiculturalism's failure. It is a sign that deep down Australians are racist, and that if you sort of pick around at the crust of tolerance and diversity, you'll soon expose a rather nasty kind of source beneath.
Well, like Pat, I also had a very strong response to Cronulla, although in my case I was in England at the time watching this unfold in my college study, and as it happened I was researching patriotism and the idea of a national culture, so the whole event really brought a new urgency to my research. For me, watching at the time, and I still stand by this feeling, it was seeing something very ugly. And for me, it was an ugly nationalism that was unleashed. What stood out for me watching the riot was the way in which national symbols were being used. They weren't being used to unite people, but they were being used to divide people. And moreover, they were being used in a way that said to a certain group of Australian society, "You don't belong here." That for me was the real meaning of Cronulla. And that's not to deny some of the complexities of the riot. There were tensions leading up to the event over months. We can talk a bit more about that perhaps. There was also a lot of media frenzy in the direct lead up to Cronulla. Don't forget that you had Alan Jones, for example, on radio calling on people to reclaim Cronulla Beach and expel the vermin that had invaded Cronulla. The lesson for me is just how difficult it is to achieve social cohesion. I think we've actually done this very well in Australia in the decades since we began post-war migration. If you look at Europe, for example, and look at the social tensions and fragmentation that they have there, riots are a regular occurrence. They're not a regular occurrence in Australia. The fact that we had Cronulla was a big shock to all of us because we didn't think that this would happen here. And I think that the episode confirms to me the importance of having a sober public conversation around questions of immigration and diversity, and the importance of having political leaders and also people in the media ensuring that things don't get out of hand, that you don't feed the beast, as it were, that you exercise restraint.
Well, let's define our terms a bit here, because multiculturalism can mean a lot of different things to different people. For some, it's just a description, it's just the reality. We are a multicultural society. For others, it's a policy response. How do you understand multiculturalism? Well,
it's both those things. It's a social reality, and we confront this every day. For example, 45% of Australians were either born overseas or have a parent who was born overseas. 1 in 5 people speak a language other than English at home. But it's also a policy, as you say, and it refers to the fact that we've had a particular way of integrating those who arrive as migrants into our community. Namely, we recognise diversity, but in the sense that it allows those who arrive to feel comfortable in this country and ultimately become Australian citizens. I think there's a third element too that perhaps isn't always looked at in discussions of multiculturalism, and that's the ethos of multiculturalism. And I think this gets to the nub of the matter. If we talk about a multicultural Australia, I think we ultimately talk about how we treat each other as citizens. And for me, it's about ensuring that everyone gets a fair go regardless of where they're from, where they're born, or their ethnic or cultural or racial background. And it's about ensuring that those who arrive here can have the freedom to have a go. So for me, it's that ethos, that sense of contributing to a nation, having the space to do it, that matters.
It has shifted, hasn't it? Since, I suppose it was introduced, Al Grasby famously was, I suppose, seen as the father of multiculturalism. It was then very much, in my understanding, about access and equity, making sure that people understood their rights and obligations, that things were translated where necessary or interpreters were provided, that sort of stuff. Whereas it's gone beyond that, I think, or it's, in your view, needs to go beyond that.
Well, it's a complicated history, and quite often we talk about multiculturalism without ever referring to its actual history. I think for many of multiculturalism's critics, the concern is that it will divide us more than it will unite us, that we can celebrate cultural differences at the expense of a common national identity. But if you look through...
Well, in fact, some people would say it emphasises difference. You know, it encourages people to live separate lives in fixed identities and not to engage with the broader society.
And I think in policy terms, we don't have that. We've actually had a very clearly defined policy that's focused on citizenship and nation building. So when Al Grasby, for example, first used the word multicultural in 1973, he referred to the idea of the family of the nation. And for him, the vision of a multicultural Australia was about ensuring that one day you could say, I am Australian, in the same way that Roman citizens could have said civis Romanus sum, and know that that statement had a resonant meaning, that there was no classes of citizenship, that if you were Australian, that would be enough. And I think it goes to rights and responsibilities. And this is perhaps where there is some misunderstanding of what multicultural policy involves. Namely, those who arrive here should be afforded the right to express their cultural heritage and identity, but that's always been accompanied in policy terms by a responsibility to accept parliamentary democracy, the rule of law, English as the national language, equality of the sexes, freedom of religion, and freedom of speech. There's no incompatibility there, and perhaps it's to our detriment that our public debate doesn't make this point often enough.
Pat, let's come back to Blue and say, tell I'll give the audience an idea of what the story actually is, because it's not about a riot, is it?
No, I can't stand this bit.
You want me to do it for you?
I feel like I get worse at describing this book the more I do it.
I'll help you out.
Why don't you have a go?
Well, I'll have a go. Okay. So Blue is set in a fictional town called Bolton, or Bolt-on, which is built around a big factory of some sort. I would suggest it resembles Wollongong, and it's about a guy called Christian, who is reminiscing about the past. He's, I suppose, in his early 40s or something like that, and he's remembering his life as a 13-year-old with his two mates, Muck and
Vern.
Muck and Vern. And Muck and Vern wag school because the surf's up. And hey, you know, why would you go to school when it's such a good day for surfing? And so he's reminiscing about this day, in fact, when he and Muck and Vernie wagged school. In fact, they didn't go surfing because the surf was too big. But they hear about this body on the tracks, that someone's been run over on the railway tracks, and there's a bit of Stand By Me, if you know the film in this, that they head off to look, to see what's left of the body on the railway tracks, because they're told that you can still see the bits of body and stuff like that. So this is an important day in Christian's youth, but it's also the day that he says was the first time he saw a blue person. And the blue people have now come, in his eyes, to dominate the town of Bolton. Blue people have about 8 arms and legs. They look very different. They eat different sorts of food. And for Christian, the day the blue people arrived is also the day that Bolton began going downhill. Is that a fair summary?
That's fantastic. That's way better than I would have done.
All right, so now the question, why blue people? Well, you know, why, if this is about multiculturalism and difference and managing change, why weren't they... Oh, by the way, blue people washed up in this big surf. They washed up in boats, right? Why weren't they Asians or Muslims or other sorts of people? Why blue?
I feel like I don't know enough about the experience of being the other in Australia to be so specific. And so for me, it was far more important to concentrate on the experience of being the local, being the Australian, and being confronted with otherness on your home turf. And so I felt it was more powerful if I kept kind of things sort of ambiguous. So a lot of people say they're aliens, but I imagine that there's some strange, they may have just crawled out of the bottom of the sea, you know, or something like that, or you know, or from an island that you know that.
You don't suggest they're aliens. I mean, Vern, one of the characters said, "Oh, they're from Africa or somewhere, haven't you heard?"
Yeah, they're from another place. Yeah.
So, were you trying to get inside the mind of the people on the beach at Cronulla that day?
Yeah. Since then, I've spent literally years, trying to do that, trying to figure out what it is that's going on at this moment, and I spent a lot of time doing academic work around this, and I kind of felt like what went on in Cronulla riot during the Cronulla riot was local people sort of defending their turf in a way that's really sort of ingrained culturally. It's sort of a big part of surf culture to kind of like protect the local from interlopers of all sorts, but then you know there's what happened at Cronulla was this sort of horrible moment where the battle for the beach sort of shut it out into becoming the battle for Australia for only a few hours, but it was this kind of like strange moment of rupture.
Why do you think it's important to understand a character like Christian in your graphic novel, who could have been at Cronulla that day?
Yeah. Because the coastal town bigot is a really complex character, and the coastal town bigot sort of does have there are all sorts of different kinds of power working on the life of someone like Christian. You've got, if you take for example a character who lives at Sandon Point in the Illawarra, and you've got sort of this incredible wave of gentrification happening. You've got the decline of the Illawarra steel industry. So that from all angles, there's kind of like there's kind of like these barbarians at the gate, like these kind of like forces that are going to change the way of life at Sandon Point.
Stuff's going wrong.
Yeah.
Things are going bad. You can't even buy a sausage roll in Bolton these days.
Yeah, you know, you can't get a wave.
You can't get a wave because of these foreigners on the waves.
And the thing is, this is something that a lot of people who write about surf culture have theorized, is that the performance of defending the local, especially out in the water, is one place where the local character has the most agency. You see, there's this guy who writes about surfers in Hawaii, and surfers in Hawaii are very, very territorial, but it's often the case that the surfer who's telling the tourists to, you know, get out of the water because they might get their head punched in is the same person who will be serving the tourist at the bar that night, or, you know, like performing a different kind of interaction.
Yeah,
so,
making their living from the fact that these...
Yeah, and I mean, a great example of this is I actually moved to a place near Sandon Point recently, and I did that thing that middle-class white people do, and you know, I bought a house somewhere that I wanted to live, and the house is very expensive, and I kind of like, I for whatever, you know, reason, I'm part of this wave of gentrification. And so I went for a surf at Sandon Point. The third day after I moved in, I put my surfboard on my bike and I rode down to Sandon Point and I locked my bike up. And I was under the impression that because I'd clearly come on a bike, therefore I lived there.
You're local. It's
I'm
obvious.
local, you know, but of course not. I got told to fuck off.
Tim, I wonder what you make of this. I mean, you've read Blue, and one of the things, I mean, you talk about various responses to difference in your book. So racism, out and out racism, the idea that some races are better than others, that sort of thing. But you also talk about the desire for cultural security, or the voice of cultural loss. Is that what we're hearing here in Blue?
Well, you've taken the words right out of my mouth. I think what Pat does really well in Blue is he sketches the anthropology of cultural loss, or the psychology of cultural loss. This feeling that the place you grew up in, the country you grew up in, doesn't look the way it did. It's not the country that you think of when you think of your childhood. And I think that really gets to the nub of a lot of public concern about diversity, immigration, Islam. This is the nub of the matter. Now, the problem, I think, with the way that Friends of Multiculturalism, with the way that they've responded to it, is to say that, well, that's just an expression of racism, that deep down it is just about racism. And I think what Pat sketches really well in Blue is just how it's a lot more complex than that. These are genuine feelings, and I think if in political terms you saw this very powerfully during the 1990s with the rise of Pauline Hanson and One Nation, which was really a vehicle for expressing a sense of cultural loss. I think since then what we've had that transform into a populist form of nationalism, which sometimes is aimed very squarely at excluding people who may not look like authentic Australians, or how some people think authentic Australians should look at. But you know, this idea of cultural loss is very, very hard to deal with, because it's bound up in economic matters. The fact that Blue is set in Bolton, for example, a deindustrialising town, I think was a very nice touch, Pat, because quite often the sense of loss is tied to a sense of economic insecurity as well. Now, there are some things that you can't simply reverse. You cannot reverse, for example, the process of globalisation. How politicians and how communities deal with cultural loss is going to be very important, because Australia is going to grow more diverse, I think.
Well, how do we deal with it? Because as you say, it's I mean, if you don't dismiss it as racism, or you don't say people just need more education or whatever it is, if there are legitimate feelings here which will be expressed politically, that's a real challenge, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I think it starts by accepting the fact that national identities are never frozen in time, that communities change, your sense of Australianness evolves. Now, it may not involve a dramatic change overnight, but there are certain things that I think are telling. Think of what our national dish is today. The fact that Thai food is the most popular form of takeout. Or think of the fact that the cappuccino is the most popular hot beverage in this country. If you had turned the clock back to Australia in 1953, I don't think Arthur Caldwell would have, or others would have anticipated this as a result of post-war migration.
Tim, you don't have to turn it back that far. I mean, I grew up in Adelaide. I was born in 1962, and I remember my father taking me to the Adelaide Arcade because that was a place where you could get an espresso. I mean, there was very few places you could buy a coffee in, say, the late 70s, mid 70s.
Yeah. But I think that the idea that things don't stay the same and change is fundamental to grappling with this. Now, I think there are still many things about the Australian identity and culture that remain the same, and that's a good thing, because I, for example, take very seriously the notion of a fair go, the idea that we're an egalitarian people and that we're not too stuffy and over the top with our formalities. The fact that we can hop into the front seat of a taxi without any qualms, the fact that we refer to people by their first names rather than as Mr. or Mrs. These are good things, and I think they express a particular Australian character which anyone can buy into, which anyone can express, and that's how I suppose with the work I'm doing, I try and make sure that multiculturalism isn't just understood as a cultural thing, but also as a civic thing about how we treat others as fellow citizens. But in all this, to go back to your question, proportion and level-headedness is very important. I think too often now we have politicians who are very eager to cash in on fear and anxiety, and that's taking the low road. For a long time, Australia benefited from having a bipartisan consensus about how to manage its post-war immigration program and diverse society. I think what we're seeing at the moment is perhaps a new bipartisan consensus emerging, particularly as it's expressed around asylum seekers, and that threatens to undo the work that's been done over the past few decades.
We might come back to that theme in a moment. Pat, I want to talk to you a bit about the graphic novel as a form and why, for you, it works to deal with these issues. Okay. Because you draw, I mean, I'm just going to hold up. I know you're a long way away out there, but, you know, these are quite amazing images that Pat has drawn. And they really, you know, he's spent a long time looking at waves, looking at the beach, looking at the landscape around the Illawarra, I think. So why... And you draw them all by hand, right?
Yeah.
So tell us a bit about the process.
I draw on these giant pieces of paper, and I use ink and a brush. I use really old school tools. But yeah, I'm really interested in comics as a sort of a way of tracing the moving body. So like I kind of like to think of it as a performance, but there's a performance with no real audience. It's just a comic nerd alone in their dingy little art cave. But
well, you've said in a piece you wrote about Blue that the experience of being at Cronulla that day had a physical effect on you.
Yes. Yeah.
And that the drawing is a way of expressing that.
Yeah. So comics are really good at dealing with flesh. You know, like if you think about the sort of stuff that ends up in comics, it's, you know, it's a sort of like bodies, it's superhero bodies, and, you know, or in sort of alternative comics, it's often like creepy, spotty, shuddering bodies or zombies, or, you know. So there's something about the form that speaks to like this sort of like corporeal ways of knowing, and that's kind of like what I'm really interested in, like as part of my practice, like kind of like trying to tease out like body sort of embodied knowledges and muscle memory and all that kind of stuff, and sort of including that in in the work. It's a kind of meta language that you can't quite put your finger on, but like it kind of I hope it kind of gets under the reader's skin.
You also, I mean, in the back of the book, you have actually an essay about the history of surfing comics in Australia.
Yeah.
So you actually also see yourself connected to quite a long literary, graphic history.
Yeah, it's what comics sort of has one of those histories where we kind of have to, we have to invent histories because there's no historians really writing about comics in Australia. There are a few, but so I took it upon myself to create a new sort of strand of Australian cultural history, sort of about Australian surf comics, particularly about Tony Edwards, who for younger enthusiasts has been very difficult. His work has been very difficult to find. He's the guy who drew Captain Good Vibes in the 70s and 80s.
The other two who you document and reclaim for us are Gonad Man.
Yeah.
And
Gonad Man.
Captain Good Vibes. There was one other, I think, wasn't there? There's the Furry Freak Brothers and things like that.
Yeah. Underground comics is a kind of fairly well understood sort of movement that came out in the late 60s with Robert Crumb and Gilbert Shelton, and there were all these cartoonists in Australia working on this stuff, and a lot of the time it was connected to the sort of the countercultural surf wave, or the surf culture at the time. And so yeah, I'm kind of like those were the images that spoke to me when I was a sort of a teenager growing up in a very boring little coastal town. But
you also identify in that a kind of an unconscious racism in those early comics.
Yeah, I think there's an unconscious racism in most surf media, even now. I work for them, and there's I think that's still current. And I have done a lot of comics for surfing magazines, and even it's horrifying to realize it, but even my own work sort of in that context kind of like starts to reflect ideals that I don't feel I hold, just because of the working in a magazine that has a particular way of presenting the world
and a particular audience.
Yeah, and a particular audience.
And because you've said that you're more likely to encounter vehement nationalism and territorial violence at the beach than any remnant of that counterculture.
Yeah, you don't see the old
culture.
Sandmans or the Volkswagens anymore. You see trade vans and utes and and sort of horrible bumper stickers.
So you're a bit nostalgic for something.
I'm nostalgic for something I didn't even witness, maybe. I'm nostalgic for a surf culture that's progressive and left-leaning. Yeah.
And interestingly, your character Christian, I mean, the novel, the graphic novel Blue, ends ambiguously or ambivalently. I'm not quite sure what the best word is. There's no neat conclusion. Christian doesn't go out and make friends with a blue person and they all live happily ever after.
Yeah.
But he does kind of reflect, doesn't he? He has a moment of reflection. Then he says, when you start telling stories about your life, things seem more clear-cut than they were when you were living it. So there is a kind of question mark at the end, I suppose.
Yeah, I don't like any. I think if you write a book about immigration and race in Australia and it presents easy answers or easy resolutions, then you're probably not doing it right. And I don't really sort of like want to think we need more books in the world like To Kill a Mockingbird. I'm probably more interested in books that speak to the uncomfortable moments of cultural difference, because I think that's maybe where we have to go.
Tim, I'd be interested in your response to that.
Well, I mean, just to echo Pat, I think the challenge is surely to provoke more of us to think empathetically with those who are different to us. It's easy to pathologise those who arrive, particularly by boat, as queue jumpers, or as people who are economic migrants motivated by something other than fear of danger in their homeland, to pick the asylum seeker example. I think we can do with just a bit of a pause and a bit of a moment to reflect. I think of my own parents' experience, and they went to France as refugees before coming to Australia as migrants. But when they arrived in this country, they didn't speak much English. And I always think of the process that they went through in integrating as Australian citizens. I think, for example, of my father reading the Sydney Morning Herald every day with a French-English dictionary by his side so that he could build his English vocabulary. I think of him sitting, watching TV, and I think we've spoken about this before, Peter, watching TV, watching the cricket, trying to make sense of this strange sport. Indeed, good luck with that. But fast forward 3 decades, you find him now on a summer's day, a typical summer's day, sitting there watching the cricket. And he's usually quite good at knowing when an LBW is an LBW as well. But I think, when I tell people this story, it often is a surprise to them because they think that my parents arrived in this country speaking fluent English, but they didn't. They didn't at all. And I think to do that exercise in empathy can go a long way, perhaps, to achieving progress on what are very, very hard debates. I mean, Pat, you're entirely right to say there's no simple answer, but perhaps it begins with a bit of humility from all of us.
Let me pause for the applause and then ask you another question, because you've raised the issue of boats and asylum seekers. So I'm going to channel Philip Ruddock for a moment. And Philip Ruddock's argument is that the arrival of boats is the biggest threat to multiculturalism. I'm paraphrasing him here. The argument being this, that as long as migration is an orderly process, a process organised by governments, managed well, people accept it. But when it becomes a disorderly process, a spontaneous process, that undermines the whole thing. It's not just about asylum seekers, it undermines the whole notion of migration and the viability of migration. So how do you respond to that argument?
Well, I'll say two things. First, I think the biggest threat to multiculturalism and to social diversity in a harmonious Australian society today is the cultivation of fear and anxiety by politicians. The second thing to say is that, of course, an orderly migration program is important. But let's accompany any declaration of principle with some facts. And the facts are these. You can talk about flotillas arriving on our shores, of suburbs being overrun by asylum seekers, but how many actually arrive by boat every year? And how does that sit with arrivals of asylum seekers elsewhere in the world? I mean, Pakistan has to deal with hundreds of thousands of refugees from Afghanistan. America deals with something in the order of 700, I believe, thousand unauthorized immigrants arriving from the Mexican border. Europe, again, deals with hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants. If we have a bit of proportion in our debate, I think we can rest a little more easy knowing that there's a big moat around Australia that makes it very hard for anyone who wants to arrive here by boat. And those who do arrive here by boat, in the main, turn out to be genuine refugees. They're fleeing from places like Afghanistan. If you're an Hazara Afghan and you're facing certain death, then I think it makes perfect sense to throw the dice and hop on a boat and arrive. So I don't disagree with the fact that you need an orderly migration program. Of course you do, but you need to accompany that with some proportion and maturity.
It's the symbolic sort of effect of the moat being crossed, isn't it? That's kind of what's going on with the paranoia around boat people. It's the sort of invasion of shores, and like this. For some reason, it speaks to this broader paranoia
Well, I think it's an assertion of power, isn't it, Pat? I mean, if we go back to the point earlier about cultural loss, how does someone feeling cultural loss assert themselves? How do they take control of things? How do you regain your community again? You really can't. And I think when you look at the debate, survey how it's evolved during the past decade, this is the debate about asylum seekers, I think what you're seeing is an assertion of sovereignty. You know, economic globalisation might be changing our communities, migration may be changing the face of the neighbourhood very literally, but by God, we will assert our sovereign right to determine who comes here. I think that's the kind of logic that prevails.
So while we know that, international movement of capital and trade and goods and so on is part of a globalisation, we're going to try and keep the lid on
People.
Right.
Yeah, I think anyway, in my interpretation, I think there are elements of this very primal need to assert sovereignty in this debate.
Now, you suggested we need a different kind of conversation, a different kind of leadership, and I think, Pat, you're agreeing with that. How are we going on that?
Well, there's more to be done. I don't think the last week has been very encouraging, and I'm referring here first to the comments by opposition immigration spokesperson Scott Morrison about the need for behavioural protocols to be introduced to regulate asylum seekers and for local communities to be made aware of when an asylum seeker is being housed in their local area. But on the Labor side too, I see a lot of troubling rhetoric around temporary migrants, namely those on 457 visas. And for me, there's something worth reflecting on when you hear people talk about Australian jobs first, or that we need to protect Australian jobs. I think that kind of language can inflame concerns about immigration and multiculturalism. So in that sense, we perhaps are not doing as well as we have in the past.
I'm just going to tell a little anecdote because it's in your book, Tim, and that is that Tim's associated with the Labor Party. As I said, he worked for Bob Carr, and he had a thought about a political career. I don't know whether he still harbours those thoughts or not, but he got advice that if he wanted to run for pre-selection, he better change that surname to something a bit easier, right? Yeah,
well, it really just emerged in a very casual conversation. I wasn't broaching any political career per se, but someone who now, funnily enough, holds a seat in Parliament said to me, Tim, all fine and good that you're interested in politics, you may well have a good career in it, but you got to change your name. But one wonders whether Barack Obama would have had the same success if he were Barry O''Obama, as we were saying earlier. I mean, I think you have to be true to yourself. And to make a serious point out of a light anecdote, I think that's the beauty of the way we do multiculturalism here. It's about making sure that you can identify as an Australian, but there's more than one way you can be Australian. There's no typical authoritative way you can be Australian. You can be comfortable in your skin. And I think that's the real challenge for us, to ensure that we can allow people to be comfortable in their skin, because if they are, then they will embrace Australia and everything that it offers.
If you'd like to ask a question, we can take some questions from the floor, so I'll flag that. Then they're roving microphones, I'm not sure, but we can relay questions if there's not. Yes, there's a microphone. Sorry, I should have known that. There's a microphone in the middle there. So if you'd like to ask a question, please make your way to the microphone and I'll take a question from you. But Pat, do you have a response to that question of how we're doing on this?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's... I just have a real problem with the way people feel the need to define themselves by Australianness. And I just don't... I think that's kind of part of what went wrong with... What goes wrong with like incidents like Cronulla. It's like I think people love their, like, people sort of, they love the landscape that they grew up in. They love the culture they grew up in, and they're proud of all that stuff. But I think a lot of people assume that stuff which is very specific to their lives, is what Australianness is, when it's actually something a lot smaller. It's kind of like, you know, like the globalization theorists often talk about like nationalities as being an imaginary. It's so like kind of subscribing to something like Australianness is like a sort of an act of faith. And I kind of, yeah, I think it would be more helpful and maybe more productive if we kind of like defined ourselves by something a bit smaller that wasn't so pan-continent.
So I'm a local. This is my wave.
Oh yeah.
No, I was joking. But.
Yeah, but something about like sort because of people like value defining themselves by the communities that they move through and the you know, like even the landscapes that they actually see and feel and smell, rather than this sort of imagined sort of Australian outback that we often don't have any interaction with at all. So yeah, I don't know. I would prefer that if Australianness wasn't so much moored in our personal identity.
Yeah, I think, you know, if I can jump in, I think just talking more seriously about our values can be a useful starting point. And it's not about where you're from, but if you're willing to have a go at something, and I think we all like to have a go at something as Australians, and I think that's good enough.
Okay, let's take the question.
Question is for Tim. Tim, you mentioned the fact that we welcome new arrivals and they are to obey the Australian law. What is your attitude when Muslim clerics in the west of Sydney or somewhere advocate Sharia law? That doesn't sit comfortably with, I think, most of the old Australians. What would you do about that?
Well, it doesn't sit comfortably with me either, and I consider myself an advocate and defender of Australian multiculturalism, and the reason for that's clear. There are limits for how you can express your diversity and your religious beliefs. It has to exist within the framework of our Australian civic culture. Now, I think what often isn't added on here in such a response is the fact that we shouldn't recognise Sharia law for the very same reason that we shouldn't recognise Roman canon law or Jewish Hachacha law or Buddhist doctrine as our official law. It's because we have a secular Australian body of law, and within that body you can express your cultural identity and your convictions, your religious convictions, but there has to be clear limits, and those limits I don't think extend to something like Sharia. Because
this is one of the criticisms of multiculturalism, is that it sort of devolves into a kind of mushy relativism where that's your culture, therefore that's legitimate, therefore it's okay.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a difference between being plural and being a relativist. You can embrace cultural pluralism, the fact that identities can exist in more than one form, but that's not to say that you therefore lose all of your convictions, that you don't stand for anything. I think you can still judge, and we should still judge. If something doesn't afford an individual the right, freedom or equality, then we shouldn't endorse it.
Okay, another question.
Firstly, thank God for it going up. It's to Tim. I'm a well-accepted, long-time descendant of the dirty Irish. But we've had a series of waves. In your experience and judgment, as a new wave comes, does the previous wave become accepted so that now the Southeast Asians who are the PowerPoints have been displaced by Lebanese and Turks and now the Afghans? And the Afghans are the latest horror. The others seem to be accepted. Is this your experience?
So is there a kind of hierarchy based on time, as it were, you know, that when your parents came, they might have been the bottom of the heap, but now to be a Hazara Afghan who's the bottom of the heap?
Yeah, I think there's an element of initiation in how Australia receives its migrants. There was someone who said that on September 11, 2001, the Asians of Australia could have breathed a bit easier because there was a new public enemy number one. Muslims. I think there's something in the idea that new arrivals have it slightly tougher than those who've been here before, for all sorts of reasons. But I think what shines through in my reading of Australian history is just how robust we've been in accepting waves and waves of immigrants from all over the world. The fact that we have accepted 7 million migrants since since the end of the Second World War, and have done that without the kind of segregation or division that you see elsewhere, is to our credit, and it shows that we are able to absorb different groups into a national identity, and that's broadly defined.
Another question.
When we're discussing multiculturalism and new arrivals, I'm a new arrival, and I'm white, and I speak English, and this year I will qualify for Australian citizenship, which I intend to take, because I live here and want to live here. And the question that I have is, has the argument shifted in terms of what it is to be Australian, to be are you not white and do you not speak English? Yeah.
Maybe I'll answer it this way, and say that racism remains alive and well in some respects. And while researching my book, I went through and looked at how Australia is represented, for example, in our TV and our media. What struck me was looking at the cast list of Neighbours and discovering that the first Asian family that arrived on Ramsay Street lasted only a few weeks, and the character, one of the main characters, Sunny Lee. If there are devotees of Neighbours here, then correct me if I'm wrong, but Sunny Lee was one of the first substantial characters of an Asian background on Neighbours. But even then, she was an exchange student from Korea, I think. If you look at the casting of our leading TV programs, I don't think you see the authentic face of Australia as it actually exists at the moment. So what I'm trying to say is that at the level of our everyday understanding of Australia and consumption of Australia, we perhaps are not as diverse as we could be. But I don't know if that answers your question squarely enough. I'm sure Pat has some thoughts on this too.
Yeah, I kind of think of Australianness as something not that you are, but something that you do. It's kind of like a skill that that you take in by being here, and I think that for a lot of different cultures, like taking in that skill, takes different sort of like amounts of time, and I kind of that kind of connects with the last question too. Yeah, I don't know really where I'm going with that, but
I want to just follow up on that before we take the next question. That is around the idea of citizenship, because, Tim, our multiculturalism has been built on a notion of citizenship. That is, migrants come to Australia and become permanent residents and become citizens. Mm-hmm. Now, we have a very new, and this is a particular interest of mine, but we have a very new situation in the last 10, 15 years where a lot of our migration is actually temporary. People working here, sometimes for quite long periods of time, on a temporary visa. They don't become permanent residents. They pay taxes and so on, but they're not necessarily on a path to citizenship. So what does that imply for multiculturalism?
Well, as I argue in the book, I think this is one of the big challenges facing our multicultural model. The model can be explained very simply like this. Think of those who arrived from Europe after the end of the Second World War and came here on the Snowy scheme and worked and settled here permanently, became Australian citizens. That is what I understand to be at the core of the citizenship model. You arrive here, you eventually become an Australian with all the rights and responsibilities that are involved. But if you have people who are transient here or are only here for 2 or 3 years, I think you do have a potential rupture from that citizenship model. What strikes me about temporary migration And bear in mind that temporary migrants now outnumber those who arrive as permanent settlers here now.
Under the skilled program,
Yeah.
at least, yeah.
What strikes me about this situation is that we perhaps haven't had the kind of debate that you would have expected of an issue that is of such profound social significance and impact. The recent arguments around 457 visas suggest to me that the issue is now starting to be debated. I would hope that this matures into a debate that avoids the hysteria that we've seen on occasion so far.
Okay, last question, thank you.
Yes, I'd address this to all three of you. And this is, would you like to comment on the role of the media in terms of having a level-headed and proportionate debate on these issues? Or goes as far as to say, how might we get them to have a more proportionate and a balanced debate? Because it seems that we're in that short news cycle, and also that the media loves to grab, as they do in politics with the personal. With this, they tend to grab onto the conflict model. So they report conflict, I think of the Cronulla thing, but where are we getting the balanced debate, the subtleties of what you've been talking about today?
Tim, Pat?
Well, thank you for the question. Where does one begin in terms of fixing our media landscape? Oh boy. Let me answer it this way. I wonder whether we might end up with a more mature debate if we have well, this is a big hypothetical. I should add this as a preface. I wonder about how a potential coalition government's going to handle these issues, because for the past few years in opposition, I think they've been very relentless at ramping up the temperature on the asylum seeker issue. It's going to be very different for them in government when they discover that boat arrivals are simply not going to stop. This is a fact of human migration and movement in a 21st century world. Who knows, maybe the responsibilities of government may lead to greater maturity in how these matters are debated by members of the Liberal coalition. It's very hard to prescribe any clear or any simple solution to how we can clean up the media on this, but I think it begins with accepting that we have a responsibility as citizens to call things out which are incorrect or which vilify our fellow citizens or people who are potentially going to be our fellow citizens.
Pat, you want to comment on the media?
I've been so disillusioned by the media for so long that I really can't comment on on the way things are right now, except that I think media empires are crumbling, and that's great. We've got. Yeah, there's new windows for discussion that are going to be opening up every day, and have been opening up every day. And I think that's where we look for the fulfilling debate, not in the papers, or especially not on TV.
Okay, I'm going to avoid the question because I have to wind up. I do have things to say about this, but I'm not going to say them now, especially not with jets going overhead. So let's drown out the jets, and please join me in thanking Tim and Pat.